Hi, my name is Syler Peralta-Ramos, and I'm a nature photographer and guide based in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. This is a video I didn't expect to make, about a lens that I never expected to own, but I recently made a big change in my lens lineup, and I wanted to share some of that with you all. So without further ado, welcome to my review of one of Canon's most unique lenses, the RF 100 to 300mm f2.8 lens. As a quick disclaimer, I'm not affiliated with Canon in any way, and I'm not being paid to share my thoughts here. I bought this lens with my own money, so yes, I do have an inherent bias towards liking it, but all opinions beyond that are completely my own. Alright, so without further ado, let's get into this review. I just unboxed this thing. I'm so excited. This is gonna be so awesome. Yeah, this is the Canon 100 to 300, and I am so excited to test this thing out in Alaska in a couple weeks, and I can't wait to show you all the things that I get with this thing and give you my take on it. So stay tuned for that. When Canon announced this lens back in April of 2023, I really didn't think that much of it. Honestly, I found it a bit puzzling, even frustrating, because I'd really been hoping Canon would release something like a 200 to 400mm, or there was at one point a rumored 200 to 500mm, or some other large aperture zoom. At that time, I had just started my photography workshop business, and most of my work was centered around the greater Yellowstone ecosystem where I grew up. My setup at the time was the Canon EF 400mm f2.8 version 2, which I often found too short for a lot of wildlife uses, particularly with grizzly bears and other animals that you have to be relatively distant from here in the greater Yellowstone. So I often used a 1.4 teleconverter, which on EF lenses, it was okay, but it never worked great. And so that lens was much better for larger mammals like elk, bison, moose, etc. But if you've seen my previous videos, you'll know that I sold that 400mm in May of that year in 2023 and switched to the RF version of the 600mm f4, which is behind me over here. And I paired that with the 100 to 500mm f4.5 to f7.1, which works really well for wider shots in bright conditions. And for this part of the world, that was really the perfect setup. But as I grew my workshop business and my travels have become a lot more common, namely in places like Katmai, Alaska, where I go twice a year now to lead bear photography workshops. In Katmai, bears frequently come so close that the 100 to 500mm is generally a better focal length than the 600mm, but I often found myself reaching for my 600 in these situations where a wider environmental shot would have actually been better, simply because I preferred the look of the image quality and that sort of shallow depth of field quality of a 600mm prime. Now, don't get me wrong, the 600 is still a very useful lens in Katmai, especially for tighter portraits of small cubs where the animal is small even though it's close and I want to get that tighter shot. But when it's the only lens you're reaching for and you end up with a lot of the same kinds of images, it's necessary to change things up a little bit. So to try to fix this sort of overuse of my 600 that I often had in Alaska, I borrowed a 70 to 200 millimeter f2.8 from a friend of mine for my Katmai trips. But that also didn't really quite do the trick either, because my ideal focal range in Katmai tends to be somewhere between 200 and 600 millimeters. And with the 70 to 200 and 600 combo, I was stuck on the extremes. 200 millimeters was often too wide, and 600 millimeters often too long. When a bear was coming close, there just wasn't enough time to try to switch lenses from the 100 to 500 and go to the 70 to 200. So I'd end up just using the 100 to 500 instead, which was the range that I liked, but I kept looking at the images that came from it and just wished that I had that background separation quality that you get from a prime lens like the 600. And so it was at this moment that I kind of started to realize the genius of this lens here, the 100 to 300 millimeter f2.8. And Canon's decision to come out with this lens really clicked with me. So I came to realize that I was juggling 3 lenses, and the one with the best focal range, the 100 to 500, just wasn't giving me the look that I wanted. So after a lot of deliberation, I decided to make a big switch and sold the 70 to 200 and the 100 to 500 and spent my savings on the wildly expensive 100 to 300 millimeter f2.8 that I now use. At first glance, that really doesn't seem to solve everything. I mean, 300 millimeters still leaves a long gap to 600 millimeters, but here's the key. This lens works beautifully with the RF 1.4 teleconverter, giving me an effective focal range of 140 millimeters to 420 millimeters at f4. And that's a setup with almost no loss in image quality. And yes, that is a very expensive decision, about $10,000 for this lens. And no, it's not that much lighter carrying around one of these rather than those 2 lenses. But for me, from roughly 200 to 420 millimeters, where I do the bulk of my close range wildlife work, it's a major upgrade that justifies the cost in both light and image quality, because I can now have that prime lens look. I've only had the new lens now for about 2 months, but in those 2 months, I've had the opportunity to really put it through its paces in the work that I do, as my primary lens in my fall trip to Katmai, a puma trip to Patagonia, as well as during the fall season here in the Tetons in Yellowstone. So I'm now going to give you a couple examples of images that I made with this lens over this period so that you can see some of the scenarios where I found it most useful. Overall, I found that this lens came much closer to achieving that prime lens look that I was after at a wider focal length than my 600 millimeter. It definitely didn't replace my 600 millimeter by any means for the tighter, longer distance shots and portraits, but I found myself reaching for the 600 less of the time and actually being more deliberate about which lens I was using. So it allowed me to be more creative with my images. On the spring trip to Katmai this year, when I was juggling both a 70 to 200 and a 100 to 500 on my second camera body, I missed so many shots just because I was trying to change lenses in inopportune times. And as a guide, that's especially tough because while I'm shooting, I'm also helping clients get their shots. And the simpler I can make my setup, the more I can focus on helping them and still in those moments between be able to capture the moments that I want. So Is it all sunshine and rainbows with this lens? No, there are downsides. And as close to perfect as this lens may be, there are a few things that I dislike that I think are worth mentioning here. My biggest issue is that Canon seems to have designed this lens as a replacement in their lineup for a 300mm prime. And I think that's where they made a small misstep. A dedicated 300mm, like Sony, for example, has, can be a lot smaller and lighter. But this zoom could have been truly flawless if Canon had leaned into what it is and had just given it a built-in 1.4 teleconverter. Some photographers really value a small and light 300mm f2.8. But as you can see, this lens will never be that. It is a heavier lens, and that gives it the versatility that makes it so special. And teleconverter or not, it's just not ever going to be a small and light lens. Of course, a built-in teleconverter would have added a bit of bulk and cost for sure, but it also would have made this lens nearly perfect for wildlife shooters like me, and it was never going to be that other kind of lens anyway. So as it is, I use a 1.4 teleconverter about half the time, and while it works beautifully, it just is a pain to take on and off a 1.4 teleconverter. For a long time, there was a rumor that Canon might actually be able to get around this limitation of the lens with a zoomable teleconverter, which they have a patent for, which would essentially be a teleconverter that's able to switch between zero magnification and other levels of magnification without actually having to take the teleconverter off. But after many years, we still haven't seen that product, and so for now, we're just stuck with the taking teleconverters on and off. In my testing of this lens, I actually used a 1.4 teleconverter about half the time, so using a teleconverter is a very common occurrence and slightly diminishes some of the benefit of using this lens as a means of simplifying my setup from 2 lenses to 1. It requires a little bit more anticipation of the situation I'm in so that I make the right decision ahead of time whether I'll need 300mm to 420mm, or if 300mm on the long end is sufficient and I can use the 600mm to cover that long distance. And since people always ask with this lens, no, I do not recommend using a 2x teleconverter. Like most fast primes, it handles the 1.4 teleconverter extremely well, but the 2X just doesn't hold up. I tested one thanks to Colin at Pictureline, and while it's sharp enough for some to give you essentially a 200 to 600mm, I just personally found it to be too much of a compromise. If I want 600mm, I'm gonna grab my 600mm f4. I bought that lens and I bought this lens to get the best possible image quality in the range that I actually shoot, not stretch one lens beyond what it was actually meant to do. So with that, do I actually recommend the 100 to 300mm 2.8? Well, that kind of depends on who you are and whether you value the look of a shallow depth of field, or if you don't ever need a shallow depth of field to soften a background or foreground. And if that's you, you probably should just stick with the 200 to 800 or 100 to 500. If you only photograph distant subjects or don't want to work on environmental portraits, then you'd also probably be better off with a 600mm or something longer. But if you value image quality, low light performance, and that distinctive large aperture look across a versatile range, and you also want to simplify your kit, this lens is about as good as it gets. As one of those people who does really value those things, this has become my new favorite lens for wildlife photography. After all, this is my career, and this is a tool for my art, and it very well may be for you as well. If a tool can help me better achieve my creative vision, it's not an expense, but rather an investment in my work and my future. And if that resonates with you, I think you should definitely make the investment in this lens in your future as well. You're worth it. So with that, if you are interested in purchasing one of these lenses or other camera equipment, be it Canon or some other brand, I really highly recommend you guys check out Pictureline, which is based in Salt Lake City, and asking for my buddy Colin there. He was incredibly helpful in making it possible for me to get my hands on this lens before Alaska and Patagonia, which was really important to me for putting out this video and also just getting the kinds of images that I wanted on those trips. You can also get your gear from them with zero sales tax because of Utah laws, which can really add up if you're buying expensive lenses like this one. And if you liked this video and you want to help support me, I do have an affiliate link with Pictureline. And so if you are buying gear and want to support me, go down into the link below and use that affiliate code. And of course, as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. I'd really appreciate it.